In this podcast, you'll learn 11 English idioms, and we'll explain where these idioms come from and why we use them so that they'll be easier for you to remember. Is learning 11 idioms in one podcast episode biting off more than you can chew? We don't think so. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés with Reza and Craig.
Hi, I'm Reza.
And my name's Craig.
And with more than 50 years of teaching between us, we'll help you improve your English and take it to the next level. So, my friend, how are you?
I'm very well. Always excited to get back podcasting with you and to speak to our lovely listeners. How are you doing?
I'm on top of the world. I've just had one of your famous homemade buns or cupcakes, I should say. We were talking about that, how we disagreed on the word. Magdalena in Spanish. I discovered that it must be an Irish thing to say bun, whereas it's more of an English thing, perhaps to say cupcake for Magdalena. Well, whatever, I don't care. The one that I've just eaten was delicious. Thank you very much, Craig. I really appreciated it.
Well, I didn't make them, but you're very, very welcome. Banana and chocolate. And Reza did say bun, B-U-N, and not bum, B-U-M. So let's make sure that we had some cakes and not culos. The first thing this week is a message from friend of the show, Sheniz from Turkey.
Hello, Reza and Craig. I'm Sheniz. I hope you remembered me. I sent you a voice message before. I just wanted to thank you for your comments on my previous message. And Reza, I'm surprised to hear that you lived in Ankara. I guess because of it you know some Turkish expressions. Teşekkür ederim. Yes, that means thank you. You asked that which country would you like to move to in your podcast? Before responding that question, I have to say that there is an incredible amount of doctor immigration to other European countries from Turkey for several years. I'm a doctor as well, and all in honestly, I don't see any future in Turkey due to change in society. I'd like to briefly mention about this situation a little bit. Doctors are experiencing burnout and frustration. The number of patients is very high and the referral chain doesn't work. Deteriorating conditions, growing violence at work, long working hours, poor pay. The medical profession has also been under political pressure. To make a long story short, I wish best for my country and I hope all healthcare professionals can live the normal life they deserve. Thank you for listening to me. Bye.
Thank you very much, Sheniz, for sending in your message. Any comments, Reza?
Yes, Shanice, thanks very much for your message. Yes, I know what you mean. I think I've been following the news about Turkey and I see that it's beginning to get quite difficult for certain professionals to do their job to the best of their abilities. So I really admire you, your determination to work as well as you can. Well done.
And there are also problems in the UK with doctors and people working. Health professionals are asking for more money. The salary isn't keeping up with the cost of living. It's a problem in many countries. And I'm really sad to hear that it's so bad in Turkey, Sheniz. 1 or 2 points on your message. I think you forgot the preposition to after responding. You said responding that question. It's responding to that question. You respond to things. Did you notice anything, Reza?
Yes, I think you said all in honestly. I'm not quite sure because of the audio. Perhaps you didn't, but it should be to be honest. Or you could say in all honesty. Or you could just say the adverb honestly. Okay, so I'll repeat them. To be honest, in all honesty, or honestly. That's the correct way to say it.
Shanice, I really like the expression you used, burnout and frustration. You said doctors are experiencing burnout and frustration. Burnout when you have so much work, you're working so many hours, you feel stressed, you don't have time to relax. It just piles up on you to the point where you burn out. You just can't take any more. So yeah, frustration and burnout. Also, I like the expression to make a long story short. You can also say to cut a long story short and to make a long story short when you want to summarize something. So thanks again for your message. It was lovely to hear from you.
Yes, thanks, Shanice. And we're happy to hear from anybody from any country, of course. But it's really nice to have a Turkish listener because it reminds me of my time there. And you asked me if I know any more words. Not many, because as you know, Turkish is quite a tricky language if you're an English speaker. But like everybody, I remember what I want to remember. So I remember words about food, which is what I want to remember. So I'll never forget things like döner yurtlu or işkender kebab and things like that. Oh, I really miss Turkish food and people. Above all, I remember the people, so friendly. And boy, you've got some great food in Turkey.
Is baklava a Turkish sweet meat?
You've got baklava, although baklava, yeah. But my favorite was, Shanice, ekmek kadayıf. I think it's called, which is kind of like a sweet, what we might call drizzle cake. It's sponge,
with honey,
but it's got some kind of liquid in it, which makes it slightly moist, slightly humid. Oh, that was good. I love that. Turkish food and lokum, of course. Turkish delight, as we say in English. Lokum. Oh,
lokum.
Great food in Turkey.
Oh, you're making me hungry, mate. 11 common English idioms and how to use them. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of this episode. Now, we recently spoke about living abroad as an expat, and we used the expression in that episode to know the ropes. Someone who knows the ropes is experienced at what they do, and you can show someone the ropes, which means to explain them how something is done or how something works. For example, ask John, he knows the ropes around here. So that's an example of an idiom. And Reza, we've spoken about idioms in many podcasts, haven't we?
Yes, we have, and we will in many more because it's a very important aspect of English or all languages. For example, there were family idioms. That was episode 245. Idioms connected to the house and home. That was 220. Spanish idioms that don't translate literally to English. That's an interesting episode, 278. Even baseball and cricket idioms, that was 285. Gambling, yeah, you know, when you bet money and if you win, you get more back. Gambling vocabulary and idioms, 307. I think there's even more, Craig, aren't there?
Yes, we spoke about drinking idioms and expressions. That was 364. Money idioms, 389. Crime, 412. Work idioms in episode 422. Food idioms, that was one of Reza's favorite episodes, 423. Clothes idioms connected to things you wear, that was 443. And chicken idioms only about chickens, that was episode 450. So if you want to brush up on your idioms, that means get familiar with them and revise them and learn some new ones. I will list all of those episodes in the show notes to this episode, which is 486. So go to inglespodcast.com/486. You'll see a list of all of those episodes and how to listen to them.
And I tell you what, we invite you or challenge you to find a topic, no matter how unusual, and we'll see if we can make an episode about idioms based on that topics. We've done chicken already, so, you know, you'd be surprised, you know, the ideas we'd come up with. Challenge us.
Let us know. Now, we believe that it's probably easier to remember an idiom and how to use it if you know the story behind it. Where does it come from? If you can connect that in your mind and maybe even have a picture, an image in your mind of the idiom, then it will be easier to recall, to remember, and to use when you're speaking or writing English. But before we give you a list this week of our idioms, Reza, what is an idiom for any new listeners that might not know?
Okay, I'm going to start off by telling you what an idiom is not. An idiom is not a language. So if you're a Spanish speaker and you think, oh, language is idioma in Spanish, una idioma. Yes, but that's not idiom. It's a false friend. That's a false connection. Language is not the same as idiom. An idiom is a phrase that comes to mean something totally different from its literal meaning. So this new meaning typically comes from the context in which it was first used and later evolves to be used in other situations. So it's whenever the words don't have their true original meaning, but they have another meaning which everybody knows or all native speakers know. They know they're using an idiom. They're using the words in a way which is not their true original meaning.
So here are 11 common idioms with their origin stories. The first one has the word blind in it. And if you are blind, you cannot see. A blind person can't see. And the idiom to turn a blind eye to something means to ignore or pretend not to see something. For example, Reza turned a blind eye to his students who were cheating on the test. You wouldn't do that, would you? You wouldn't turn a blind eye if someone cheated?
I'm afraid I wouldn't. I would have to ask them to do the exam again. In other words, I would react. So if you turn a blind eye, you don't react. You pretend. That means you Ignore, yeah. You pretend you don't see them. Pretend is another false friend. It's not pretender. Pretend is fingir in Spanish, yeah. You pretend, you act falsely like you haven't seen it. Craig, where does the expression actually come from originally?
Well, it has an interesting backstory. The backstory is the story behind the use of this idiom to turn a blind eye. There was an admiral in the British Navy called Nelson, Horatio Nelson, Admiral Horatio Nelson. And in 1801, when he was in a battle fighting on his ships, one of his superiors, his boss, ordered him to retreat. But he didn't want to. He wanted to continue fighting. And he disobeyed this order, which was probably sent by flags on another ship, by holding his telescope to his blind eye, because Horatio Nelson lost an eye in battle and he had a black patch on one eye. So he put his telescope to the eye that couldn't see anything, and he said he didn't see the signal of the flags, and he continued fighting. So from there, we get the expression to turn a blind eye to something, to ignore it or pretend it doesn't exist. Did you know that?
I didn't know. I find it fascinating.
Yeah, me too.
It makes perfect sense now that you've explained it.
So next time, remember that famous one-eyed admiral in the British Navy looking through a telescope. Have that image in your mind and think, oh yeah, to turn a blind eye, I'm going to ignore this.
By the way, if any of you have ever visited London, I'm sure you will have seen Nelson's column.
Yeah.
Craig, you would know better than me exactly where it is. It's somewhere in the centre of London, isn't it?
Well, strangely, maybe not strangely, it's in Trafalgar Square, because there was a famous battle, the Battle of Trafalgar, and Nelson fought in that. So the column is a big, narrow pillar that's very high, and there's a statue of Lord Nelson at the top. So that's in Trafalgar Square in London. How are you feeling today, mate? You feeling okay?
Oh, I feel a bit under the weather, to be honest.
Under the weather? What does that mean, under the weather?
Well, don't worry. There's no hurricane or storm or floods. Not today, anyway. No, I'm using an idiom. So if I say to you, I'm feeling a bit under the weather today, so I'm going to stay in bed, it's not because of the weather. It just means I don't feel well. The origin of this idiom comes from sailing. So perhaps Admiral Nelson used it himself since he was a keen sailor. When sailors were seasick, whenever you feel sick because of the effect of the sea moving up and down, when they were seasick, they would go below deck. So the deck is the bit on the ship where you stand and you're exposed to the elements, the wind, the air. So if you go below deck, then you're not exposed to the elements. So you don't know exactly even what the weather is when you're below deck. So they used to go below deck to avoid the weather. Maybe it was windy, maybe it was even too hot, who knows, whatever. So I'm feeling a bit under the weather. You're not feeling great, so maybe you're going to stay at home, or maybe you're just not going to do too much, like a sailor who went below deck.
And I want to thank Diana, who is a student of mine in the conversation groups that I run, who taught me the story behind that idiom, because I had no idea. So thank you, Diana, if you're listening. Now let's go from 2 idioms about sailing and the sea to 2 idioms connected to hunting. When you're hunting, you might want the animals to run out from behind a bush. A bush is a very small tree. It's a plant that grows wild, and sometimes birds or other animals, rabbits perhaps, they hide in the bushes and you want to get them out. So the expression to beat around the bush, that's what hunters used to do. They used to hit or beat the bushes so that the birds and the animals would run out. But sometimes they would not do it with a lot of force. They would do it very timidly or very cautiously. So if you beat about the bush or beat around the bush, you avoid talking about the main point or the main issue. Let's imagine I'm having a conversation with Reza and he's not really talking to me in a direct way. I could say, Reza, stop beating about the bush, just tell me what you think. Speak to me directly, don't beat about the bush.
Our next idiom is to be barking up the wrong tree. So we've had bushes, which is like a kind of a tree, but not very high. And now we've got trees, but there's no connection between the two. To be barking up the wrong tree means to follow a false lead, a lead like a clue, yeah, or a sign, or having incorrect thoughts about a situation or an event. For example, if you think it was me who ate the last chocolate biscuit, you're barking up the wrong tree. Can you guess who it was? Yeah, you didn't have to think about that for too long, did you? It was Craig. So don't blame me. Don't look at me. Yeah, you're barking up the wrong tree. It's Craig you should be asking.
And this phrase comes from hunting again and the use of dogs, because the dogs bark up trees where they see the rabbit running, or something they're chasing runs up a tree. So maybe the rabbit or the animal escaped to a different tree and the dogs are barking up the wrong tree. So they're barking up the tree where the animal didn't run. So it comes from hunting, to bark up the wrong tree, to follow a false lead, or have incorrect thoughts about a situation or event. The next one is to be mad as a hatter, or as mad as a hatter. Mad is a synonym of crazy, eccentric, and that's basically what it means. A hatter was a person who made hats. And many years ago, in the 18th and 19th centuries, hatters, people who made hats, they used to use mercury in the process of hat making. And this can cause damage to your brain. Neurological damage and symptoms like tremors and hallucinations and mood swings. So that's where the idiom comes from. These hatters, these hat makers, they sometimes went crazy because of the mercury. So if you are as mad as a hatter, you're eccentric, you're crazy, you're mad.
I find that really interesting, Craig. I didn't know that until you told me about it. I thought it had just been invented for the famous book Alice in Wonderland. You know how there's the Mad Hatter, who's a very well-known character in that. He's a hatter and he's mad. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh, that must be where it comes from. This character that was invented by Lewis Carroll. But no, Lewis Carroll didn't invent it. He just used the general thinking of the time that hatters were mad.
That's right. Yeah, because it happened before when they were using this mercury. That was before he wrote Alice in Wonderland. So he took that idea. He probably promoted it, made it used more in the language. But yeah, it came before him.
Okay, our next one is to bite off more than you can chew. Well, to bite something is to put something in your mouth and use your teeth to break it. And to chew then is what you do afterwards if it's food. You don't just bite something and then swallow it, make it go down into your stomach. You've got to chew it. If you wanted to be very formal, you could say masticate. But...
Masticate, you said.
Yes, you've got to be careful with your pronunciation there. So mastication is the same as chewing.
That makes you go blind as well, doesn't it?
Yes, if you overdo that. So if you bite off more than you can masticate, more than you can chew, you have taken on, in other words, you've accepted to do more than you can really handle or manage. Has it ever literally happened to you? I mean, have you ever bitten a piece of meat that you were going to eat and then thought, oh, right, I've actually bitten too much here. Literally, I'm not going to be able to chew it all.
It's in your mouth and you can't eat it.
So a typical kind of everyday use of this expression might be something like this. She bit off more than she could chew when she agreed to work on 3 projects at the same time. Yeah, she didn't have enough time. 1 or 2 projects was enough. 3 was impossible. She bit off more than she could chew. So there's no real mystery to the origins of this one. It comes from biting a large piece of something and then not being able to chew it. So that has become metaphorical now in the idiom, to bite off more than you can chew.
Yeah, it happens to me a lot with work. I say yes to things and then I have too much work and I realize I've bitten off more than I can chew. Let's go from food to music. Now, I said before that it might help you to create an image in your mind that you connect to these idioms. And when I think of our next idiom, I think of somebody playing the piano with one of their ears, banging on the keyboard of the piano, dung, 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 with their ear, because to play it by ear means to improvise something or to adapt to a situation when you don't have a fixed plan. And this comes from music, where people who play by ear means they can play music naturally without reading the music, without reading the notes and the sheet music. So, for example, we don't have a reservation for dinner, but let's just go, let's play it by ear and see if we can find a place to eat. We'll play it by ear, we'll improvise because we don't have a plan.
Our next idiom is to bite the bullet. That means to perform a painful task or endure an unpleasant situation. I'll give you an example. I have to bite the bullet and tell my boss about the mistake I made. I'm not looking forward to it because my boss is not a nice man and I know he's going to shout at me, but he's going to find out. I have to bite the bullet. I have to do it. Don't want to do it, but I have to do it. So this expression, to bite the bullet, it's an idiom which it dates back to the 18th century when soldiers would actually physically bite on a bullet, what you put in a gun to fire the bullet. And they would do that during surgery when they were being operated on to endure, to tolerate the pain because there wasn't enough anesthesia. So in a hospital, when they're going to operate on you, they'll give you anesthesia, so you don't feel pain. But in the middle of a battlefield, there is none or not much anesthesia. So they have to do terrible things like amputate arms and legs. And apparently, it's a natural reaction to want to bite. And if you didn't bite a bullet or something similar, you could bite your tongue off. There are stories of people biting so hard that
because of the pain.
The pain, it's a natural reaction that your body has. So they used to give them this bullet. They put the bullet, so a bullet's very hard, in their mouths, and they would bite on that. And so that would occupy their teeth rather than their teeth cutting off their own tongue. So that's where the expression "to bite the bullet" comes from. You're not going to like this. We're going to cut your arm off, but bite on this bullet, and we're going to head and do it anyway.
Let's hope that the health service doesn't get so bad that Shanice has to give her patients bullets to bite on. Now, speaking of losing an arm, if something costs you an arm and a leg, it's very, very expensive. It costs a lot of money. Oh, I can't afford to buy a new car. These days they cost an arm and a leg. So, a lot of money. Well, where does that come from? This was interesting to me. The story goes back to the 18th century, where people used to create paintings, do paintings of famous people. People like George Washington, for example. They'd have their portraits painted professionally. However, that could be quite expensive. So if you didn't have a lot of money, you would have your portrait painted without your limbs, without your arms, without your legs showing in the painting, because that will be cheaper. So having limbs costs you more money. It cost an arm and a leg.
That's a really weird idea.
Isn't that interesting?
It's brilliant. I guess I'm guessing here, but I suppose it's just because drawing limbs, arms and legs and hands accurately is difficult. I imagine it's hard to get the fingers just right, the pose. So much easier for the artist just not to paint them.
And the cost of the paint, I suppose, and the cost of the size of the portrait. So everything costs more money. Yeah. So just paint me with no arms and paint me with no legs, just my face and shoulders. Yeah.
It's funny how in Spanish language, I've heard, I think, 2 different idioms in Spanish language, which also use body parts to say that something's very expensive. I've heard "te costará un riñón." Have you ever heard that?
Yes.
Yeah, it's going to cost you a kidney, but we don't say that in English, so don't translate it that way, but that's what it would mean. And another one I've heard is "un ojo de la cara."
Yeah, I haven't heard that one.
Not so common, yeah, but I've heard that. So an eye out of your face. So that's a very heavy price to pay for something, either a kidney or an eye. So it's curious how in Spanish then you've also got an idiom about things being expensive, referring to body parts, but different body parts.
Yeah, interesting. Let's move from paintings to carpentry. Carpentry is working with wood. And when you're working with wood, you very often have to take a nail, which is a very thin piece of metal that you then hammer when you hit so that it goes into the wood and joins the wood to another piece of wood. The expression "to hit the nail on the head" is to do something precisely and accurately, because obviously if you're using a hammer, you're hitting a nail, it has a flat head on the top. That is what you need to hit. And if you miss, it's not good. So you need to hit the nail on the head. That means you do something precisely and accurately. Can you think of an example?
You hit the nail on the head with your analysis of the situation.
Thank you.
In other words, your analysis was just right. I think you got all the information totally correct. So remember what Craig said about the carpenter. If you're like me, if you're bad at DIY, doing your own carpentry, you think you're going to hit the nail on the head, literally, but you kind of hit it at the side and then it goes in diagonally and then the thing doesn't work. So you've got to hit that nail right on the head to get it straight down in there.
Do you know that they're preparing a birthday party for you next week? Oh, sorry. You didn't know that, did you?
Oh, no, you've ruined the surprise for me.
I've let the cat out of the bag. I've told a secret by mistake. To let the cat out of the bag. Where does that come from, Reza?
Well, don't worry that there's not going to be cats at the party. Well, I hope not, because I'm allergic to them, so it would not be a nice party for me at all. No, there's not going to be any cats at the party.
No pussies.
No pussies at the party. Not this one.
What a shame.
Yeah, I'm too old for that.
You're too old for pussy.
Yeah. So I do like dogs, though. So where does this come from? Well, up to and including the 1700s, a common street fraud, deception, was to replace valuable pigs. Yes, the animal pigs, because remember, people like to eat pork in many countries, to replace them with less valuable cats. So someone would tell you that they were selling you a pig, which you were going to take home and then look after and eventually eat, I guess. But in fact, they were giving you a cat. But when the cat was let out of the bag, imagine the cat escaped from the bag, then the person would say, hold on, this isn't a pig at all. In other words, the secret, the deception was over. So in modern English, if you let the cat out of the bag, the secret or the mystery or perhaps even a lie that was being told has now been revealed. Like the cat in the bag, which wasn't a pig at all, it was a cat. That's where the origins of this idiom come from.
Interesting. Well, we've given you 11 idioms and we hope that you'll remember them. We don't want to give you any more because we don't want you to bite off more than you can chew. Let's go quickly back to the beginning just to remind you. And remember, you can see our notes and the examples in the show notes to this episode at inglespodcast.com/486. So we had to turn a blind eye, to feel under the weather, to beat around the bush, to be barking up the wrong tree, to be as mad as a hatter,
to bite off more than you can chew, to play it by ear, to bite the bullet, to cost an arm and a leg, to hit the nail on the head, and the last one was to let the cat out of the bag.
And we suggest that you play it by ear when you send us a voice message, because yes, you can write down exactly what you want to say and then read it and record it and send it, but then you're not really practicing your fluency in English. You're just practicing your writing and your reading. Why not make 1 or 2 or 3 bullet points, what you want to tell us, and then play it by ear. Turn on the recording app on your mobile phone, start speaking. If you're not happy, do it again, keep practicing, improve a little every time, and then send us your voice message to speakpipe.com, that's speakpipe.com/Inglespodcast. Emails, Reza?
If you would prefer to write, you could email craig@inglespodcast.com or me, belfastreza@gmail.com.
And apart from sending us emails and voice messages connected to this podcast, and we remind you that apart from contacting us about things you hear on this podcast and ideas for future episodes, Reza and I also teach online. So if you're interested in improving your speaking, your conversation, your fluency, and your confidence in your communication in English, contact me for information about joining an online group. And Reza, you're also teaching online.
Yes, for me, it's probably easier for a one-to-one or perhaps a couple of people, but above all, one-to-one classes, one teacher, one student online. You could maybe send me an email about that.
And again, those addresses, craig@inglespodcast.com or belfastreza@gmail.com, and they are also in the show notes. This podcast is sponsored in part by mansioningles.com. You can see the online store at store.mansioningles.net.
As always, we'd like to thank our Patreon supporters. Patreon, that's Patreon. Patreon is a program where you can sponsor us by giving a donation. It can be as little as $1.50 per month. And for the people who do that, as a way of saying thank you to them, we give them access to audio transcriptions of the podcast. So that way you have access to all the words, everything we say. If you're interested, follow the link in the show notes. It's patreon.com/English podcast.
And thank you so much for being patrons of the show. We can't thank you all individually, but we would like to say hello and thank you to our latest supporters. And they are José Luis Muñoz Olivares, Beatriz Herbada, Juan Carlos Arumbreros Fresneda, Nicolas Bilpuitz, Felipe Martinez Alcalá. And apologies if I've butchered any of those names. That means said them badly. What's next week, Reza?
Next week, we're going to be talking about common metaphors.
What's a metaphor? We will tell you next week. Until then, have a lovely week. Thank you for listening. It's goodbye from Reza.
And it's goodbye from Craig.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.